I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing saga of what Americans are experiencing as the Obama administration seeking a negotiated settlement with Iran regarding Iran's nuclear program. On Thursday, April 2nd, the day before the Jewish world celebrated the start of Passover with the first Seder night, the president announced that in Lausanne, Switzerland, Secretary of State John Kerry, working with the P5+1, had successfully concluded a preliminary framework of understanding for an imminent deal with Iran, which, according to the president, would prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability. Since that announcement, there has been a torrent of opinion in support of the president's framework and in opposition to it. And in a stunning political defeat for the president, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted unanimously in a bipartisan vote of 19-0, which included all 9 Democratic members of the committee, to move a bill out of committee, which would give Congress the right to approve or disapprove any deal with Iran over its nuclear program, a bill which the White House has now agreed Mr. Obama will indeed sign, since it's become clear that Congress is fully prepared and able to override any presidential veto. In the Jewish community, while there are also differences of opinion, there's been a great deal of criticism of the framework, especially because Prime Minister Netanyahu insists that the proposed deal does not do enough to dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Many American Jews who fear that a nuclear Iran would be a significant, if not an existential threat to Israel, are rallying against the deal for this very reason. But many Jews, as many Americans, have very little real understanding of the details of the framework and possible deal, and are more moved by emotion and by political loyalties, one way or the other, than by reason and understanding. And I don't know how many of you watching JBS right now really feel you have a grasp of the issues. So we'd like to summarize for you what the framework of understanding actually calls for, and why it would prompt Mr. Obama to claim that if it is fully implemented, it will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Is that true or not? Now, here are the 5 essentials at the heart of the framework. First, the framework limits Iran's nuclear program in many ways so that it can only be used for peaceful means. Most important, Iran's number of centrifuges would be reduced from 19,000, 10,000 of which are actually currently active, to a bit more than 5,000 centrifuges, a limitation that would be enforced for the next 15 years. In addition, in terms of enriching uranium, the process needed to create a nuclear weapon, Iran will be limited to 3.6% enrichment, far lower than the level of enrichment needed to create a nuclear weapon. Iran currently is enriching uranium up to 20% or more. And the framework limits Iran's nuclear program by forcing Iran to eliminate its existing nuclear material stockpile. Second, the framework extends what's known as the breakout period. The Obama administration claims that today, Iran is only 2 to 3 months away from nuclear weapons capability. If a deal is concluded based on the framework of understanding, the breakout period would be extended to no less than 1 year. And this extension of the breakout period to no less than 1 year would also endure for no less than 15 years. Third, the framework establishes a process of verification so that the deal is not based on a matter of trusting Iran to abide by the deal's requirements. Specifically, the framework of understanding gives the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, regular access to all of Iran's nuclear facilities, including Iran's enrichment facility at Natanz and its former enrichment facility at Fordo, which had been a secret Iranian nuclear installation hidden in the side of an Iranian mountain. Fourth, the framework of understanding calls for the lifting of sanctions, especially economic sanctions, against Iran, though it's not clear in the framework how the sanctions are to be lifted. All at once, as the Ayatollah Khomeini is insisting, or gradually over a period of time, as Iran verifiably implements all of its obligations. And fifth, there's what's described as a snapback provision, so that if Iran is found to be cheating, failing to abide by all of its obligations, the lifted sanctions would be immediately and completely reimposed, snapped back into place. Now, those are the 5 essentials of the framework of understanding which President Obama argues would, if fully implemented, prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. So does the framework of understanding indeed hold the promise of preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon or not? For some insight and analysis, we're pleased to be joined on our JBS phones by an outstanding figure in the world of Israeli national security, Charles Chuck Freilich, a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a former deputy national security advisor for the State of Israel. Chuck is also an adjunct professor of political science, teaching at Harvard, Columbia, and in Israel at Tel Aviv University. And Chuck, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Chuck, before asking you to comment on some of the details of the framework in general, what's your opinion of the deal as a whole? Is it a good deal or a bad deal?
Well, I would define it as a good, bad deal. And what that means is that it's not the deal that we wanted, and it's not the deal that President Obama wanted. It's the deal that he could get. It's a deal which, at the end of the 10 to 15-year period, will leave Iran with its nuclear infrastructure intact and in a position to try and renew its development efforts. It's a deal which I believe could have been negotiated differently and better.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the deal that the president reached, and it does give us reasonable assurance of quiet for the next 10 to 15 years, that the nuclear capability has been postponed for that period. And we'll see what happens then. Gaining time is very important in life also, certainly in Israel's circumstances.
All right. It's interesting, Chuck. You say it's not the deal we wanted, but it was the deal we could get. Why do you phrase it that way? I don't understand why we could not have gotten a better deal. What was the limitations on our getting a better deal?
Really goes back to the interim agreement from a year and a half ago. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu and other opponents, but Netanyahu has been the most vocal on this, charged that at the time, Iran was really on the ropes. It was about to cave in, and that if the administration had just held in a little longer, Iran would have capitulated, and then we would have had a better deal.
Yes.
Okay. The administration says that that wasn't the case. They weren't going to capitulate. Now, that those are two propositions that are, of course, hard to test. But in any event, the administration and the other members of the P6 who were negotiating with Iran came to that conclusion. And so they tried to reach the deal that they believed they could reach. And it's not a bad one.
Well, you know, I read the Brookings Institute report, and they favor the deal, but they described how the sanctions were really what brought Iran to the table in the first place. And so I don't understand why anyone could say that had the sanctions been left in place as You point out Netanyahu was one of those arguing for that. And if the sanctions had never been softened, whether the administration and the world would not be now, Chuck, in a much better position to work out what you're claiming could have been a better deal. So when you say it, obviously that ship has sailed, but at the same time, it seems to me that the reality on the ground at the time, a year and a half ago, would have supported those who said, don't ease sanctions without a guarantee that Iran is not going nuclear. Now, what's your take on that?
Well, again, I mean, I share the feeling that we could have handled this a bit better at the time. But that's water under the bridge. And now this deal basically, of course, two caveats, right? First of all, we don't have a deal yet. It hasn't been signed.
Correct.
And B, and there are major impediments to it actually being signed.
Yes.
Because they left the most difficult issues for the end.
Yes.
And then there's a small annoyance that the Iranians actually have to implement it afterwards. So, okay, let's assume that those two things happen. This deal does close off, or probably so. I should be very careful here. It probably closes off Iran's path to a bomb for a period of 10 to 15 years. And I'm saying that's not a bad outcome.
I understand. Now, let me push you a little bit, because, and I'm at the moment, I'm so anxious to have your opinion, because there's so much confusion, especially in the media in general, and this is a passionate issue for Jews on both sides. First of all, Chuck, the framework says that right now, Iran is only 2 to 3 months away from breakout, and that the framework would extend the breakout period to at least a year and maintain that year's length for the next 15 years. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been warning the West that Iran is very close to breakout, and he's been ridiculed, Chuck, mercilessly for these warnings in the United States and in Israel. Does the framework's acknowledgement that Iran is only 2 to 3 months from breakout confirm what Mr. Netanyahu has been saying all along?
No, because there is no one who understands the details who doesn't know that Iran is maybe 2-3 months away from the capability. There was nothing new in that statement.
What does it mean to say that Iran is 2 to 3 months away from breakout? Mm-hmm. Does it mean that in 2 to 3 months Iran will have enriched enough weapons-grade uranium to begin building a nuclear weapon, or does it mean that in 2 to 3 months Iran would have a nuclear weapon?
In 2 to 3 months, they would have enough fissile, highly enriched uranium to build the first bomb, and then they would probably need something like a year to a year and a half to complete the weaponization process.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd be in the ballpark figure of a year to a year and 3/4 from a bomb.
Is the red line for you, as it is for Mr. Netanyahu, not when will they actually have a bomb ready to use, but when will they have enough capacity to begin building this bomb over a year to a year and a half period?
Yeah, I think the really important thing is what the Prime Minister has said, is that they shouldn't really have this capability.
Yes.
Because once they have the capability, then it becomes a question of timing and will. Once they make the decision to do it, they can do it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's been the situation for the last few years. As a matter of fact, if Iran had wanted to, it probably could have crossed the so-called nuclear threshold something like 5 years ago. I'm saying if it had wanted to, it's not that it didn't want to. It wanted to, I believe, very much. But international pressure, for which the Prime Minister actually bears a great deal of credit, international pressure became too heavy, and they decided that it wasn't worth the cost. And what I tend to believe, and I can't prove this, is that, in effect, what the Iranians are doing now, assuming they sign and observe the deal, is they're saying, well, okay, current international circumstances do not allow us to get the bomb at an acceptable price. So we will wait 10 to 15 years, and then hopefully circumstances will be more propitious from our Iranian perspective. Mm. What the U.S. and Israel are saying is, well, in 10 to 15 years, we've kicked the ball down the field that far, then we're going to have to start dealing with the issue again.
Mm-hmm.
Or we might have to, unless Iran decides to change course.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, of course, another possibility.
Mm-hmm. So when the president says that if the deal is fully implemented, it will keep Iran from building a nuclear weapon, if you are correct, there's a slight misstatement there, because what he really should say is, if this agreement is fully implemented, it will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon for the next 10 to 15 years. It's not indefinite, is it?
I believe that's what the president said. He said for the next 10 to 15 years.
No, he did not. Excuse me. No, he did not. Chuck, there was no qualification. His statement was, and we have verbatim, if the deal is fully implemented, it means Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. And you're saying that at best you can say...
No. But he also added, at least in the press conference, that, of course, he said after 13 to 14 years, Iran would be back to the basic few months breakout time. So let's also not catch people by a specific statement here or there. This thing was rolled out very quickly under heavy time pressure, which was another fault. I think the president, actually, from his point of view, certainly did a good job in presenting it, but he may have made a statement or two that he would rephrase afterwards. That's not the point. Let's talk the substance here. You can never say it will prevent 100%. Okay, there's no certainty in life. But if this agreement, as it appears to be emerging, is implemented relatively successfully, Iran will not be able to break out known sites for a period of 10 to 15 years, and the additional inspections mechanisms will also make it very hard for it to do so through secret sites. Now, I'm saying hard, not impossible.
Yes.
So that's part of the ongoing attention that everyone is going to have to continue paying to Iran to make sure that they don't break out from the secret sites in this period.
Chuck, doesn't this all come down to a matter of trust, whether the West can trust Iran to abide by the obligations imposed by the deal, and whether the verification process, the provisions are ironclad enough to guarantee that Iran will not be able to cheat? Do you trust Iran to abide by the obligations of this both framework of understanding and the impending deal?
I don't trust Iran for 1 second. But the important point isn't that. It's that the President of the United States doesn't. And no, I think most of the important players in the international community don't. This isn't trust. Iran will be subject, is already, but especially under the New Deal, to the most intrusive inspections regime ever. Now, that's not, I said before, that's not ironclad. There are no guarantees here. It would be virtually impossible, or it would be, well, virtually impossible for them to break out from the known sites, because they will now all be inspected in an intrusive way. And the inspectors will have far greater access to other sites around Iran. Now, notice I said far greater access, because one of the issues that are still to be resolved here is how unrestricted that is. And let's take into account here, our demand is for complete, total, unrestricted, in no way, totally unfettered inspection.
Yes.
Now, it's really hard to achieve that. States don't agree to give a blanket license to enter every facility in their country. And the United States, with the Soviets, never gave that in disarmament talks. So the question is how we reach an agreement, and this is what still has to be worked out and why it's so difficult, that does allow a level of inspection that will make the West comfortable, and at the same time not be so totally intrusive that Iran can't accept it.
Yes. Look, there are those in the Jewish community and on the American scene, people are writing op-ed pieces every week. You see them all the time, Chuck, that say that...
I write some of them.
Yeah, that's right. Very well done, too. But that very often you hear the IAEA is not going to have enough monitoring capability, and the Ayatollah Khomeini has already said that the IAEA will not have access to Iran's military installations. So there are many people who are much more concerned about the extent to which there will be this. I mean, the way the framework is written, the inspection is supposed to be total and in every aspect of Iranian life. But there are many people who believe that's simply unrealistic, and some extent you've said that as well. So that, I don't know, I guess I'm asking you to comment on the extent to which people are very, very suspect that there will be enough verification capability to really keep Iran from cheating, and if they cheat and they don't abide by the stipulations and obligations, then this isn't a good deal at all.
Look, you're trying to push and maybe get me to say that it's a bad deal, and I'm not going to say that. And I said before, there is no such thing in real life as the kind of inspections regime that you described a minute ago, inspections into every aspect of Iranian life. It doesn't work that way. They will be subject, they've already agreed at least, to implement what's called the additional protocol of the IAEA, which allows these truly intrusive inspections. They've agreed to a little bit more. Again, there's no guarantee here. None.
Okay.
Now the question is, given the real world situation, given the alternatives, what is the best deal?
I understand.
What is the better deal?
By the way, I am not trying to get you to say it's a bad deal. I am coming to you because I believe you can give us an understanding in the midst of so much confusion, Chuck. And if you started by saying, in some ways, it's a deal that you're unhappy with, and then you also said that you believe it's sort of the best deal we could get. I thought that was a very honest, straightforward statement.
Okay. So now let me say, there is an element here of doubt, and there's a hope that is attached to this deal. It's not a condition for the deal, but it's attached to it. And the hope is that over the period of the next 10 to 15 years, Iran will begin to moderate. And I'm putting it cautiously, begin to moderate. Of course, it would be nicer if it went far beyond that. Now, if that's the case, then we have an initial opening here between Iran and the United States after decades of enmity, which hopefully may lead to some sort of better relationship between the U.S. and Iran, and consequently have positive effects on Iranian behavior in the region. That absolutely may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, as a matter of fact, I would even say it's more likely that it won't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Then we will find ourselves in the same difficult position we're in today, 10 or 15 years from now. In some ways, it'll even be worse, because today we have what's called an international sanctions regime or architecture in place. And at the end of the 10 to 15 years, we won't. We'll have to start almost from scratch.
Yes.
And the question that I think each listener should ask himself or herself is, given the alternative, not what we want, but the real world alternative, is this deal a reasonable compromise, because it's a compromise deal? And are the risks of the kind that we can manage and are worth taking?
Okay. Let me ask you one last question. There are those who say these negotiations really have been a total charade, that the sad reality is Iran will one day, probably in less than 10 to 15 years, have nuclear weapons capability, which is why there are those who argue that if a deal wins any delay in Iran's going nuclear, the deal is worth it. What's your opinion on whether the reality is Iran's getting a nuclear weapon and all we can do is delay it?
Any country that has been determined to go the whole way and has been willing to pay the prices, international sanctions or displeasure, has gone there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Iran clearly doesn't seem to want to pay that price. Remember, I'll just say what I said before. They could have crossed the threshold a good 5 years ago. They didn't. So anyone who's going to make the argument they make now, and they may be right, but they have to explain why Iran will behave differently in the next 5 years when some things are beginning to change there. The election of President Rouhani is some small sign of change. If Iran wants to go nuclear, they have to do one of two things. They're going to have to either break out of known sites, assuming the deal is signed, in which case we will know virtually immediately. That they won't be able to hide. The other thing that they could do is what's called sneak out from the secret sites. Well, if they have these secret sites, they can do it today. And this deal doesn't make it easier for them to have secret sites. It actually makes it harder because of the expanded inspections. So could this happen over the next 5 years? Yes, or 10 years. That's what we have to watch out for.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, what would you tell our audience watching now? We have Jews and non-Jews watching, but you know how passionate the Jewish community has been. You know the stance that Prime Minister Netanyahu has taken, warning all of us of the impending existential danger that could threaten Israel if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon. What would your advice be to the Jewish community now as it looks like this deal, if Iran agrees that this deal will go forward? What would you have Jews feel and think and do?
I live in Netanya. Okay? It's near Tel Aviv. There's a chance if the Iranians actually get a bomb and a missile, they'll fire at Tel Aviv, they'll miss to hit Netanya. Look, we have a long national history, and a rather bitter one. And we take these things very seriously. And Iran, or a nuclear Iran, may truly pose an existential threat. It may. We're not there yet. And the international community is trying to prevent it. I don't count on the international community. I count on a three-letter difference in Jewish existence. That's called the IDF. And we can take care of ourselves. Mm-hmm. Israel cannot be destroyed by anyone today. I'm saying it quite simply, cannot be destroyed.
Okay.
And not by the Iranians, including if they cross the threshold. So let's put this in proportion. It is very serious. It is a major threat that we have to deal with over the next few years, and everyone should remain very seized with this, because we have to make sure that the pressure is still on Iran. 10 to 15 years is a long time. But next week we're celebrating Israel's 67th Yom HaAtzmaut, independence, and 10 years from now we'll be celebrating the 77th in a country which is a vibrant democracy and which is doing very nicely economically.
Chuck, you bring a very profound nuance to your analysis that is refreshing for me to experience, and you're a delight to speak with. I look forward one day to speaking to you in studio, in person. Right now, I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha, and I thank you so much for giving us some time here on JBS.
My pleasure.
Thank you. The thoughts of Charles Chuck Freilich, Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and a former Deputy National Security Advisor for the State of Israel. And again, he gives us a real perspective, something for us to think about. His point, it's not the deal we wanted, but it may be, in fact, from his perspective, a good deal. You can agree or disagree. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, our production manager, Serge Goldberg, to JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.